Welcome, fellow history explorers. Today, we're stepping back into a moment of time that shook the very soul of Japan, 1637, a year when faith, courage, and unwavering belief clashed with the brutal force of the Tokugawa Shogunate. This is the story of one of Japan's most daring and tragic uprisings, the Shimabara Rebellion, where a group of ordinary people, driven by their faith, rose up against an empire that sought to obliterate their beliefs. Imagine living in a world where religion isn't a personal freedom, but a threat to those in power, where your right to worship, to believe, is seen as an act of rebellion, a crime punishable by death, torture, and isolation. This is the world the Christian peasants of Shimabara found themselves in. They were not warriors. They were not soldiers. They were farmers, mothers, fathers, children, and most of all, they were people of faith. But when their beliefs were threatened by a cruel regime, they were forced to become something else. Rebels. Far from the capital of Edo, in the secluded village of Shimabara, these farmers had found peace in the Christian faith, even as their lives were constantly under threat. The Tokugawa Shogunate, determined to wipe out Christianity, subjected them to persecution, violence, and constant humiliation. Despite this, their faith never wavered. Instead, it became a beacon of resilience, and ultimately, a call to arms. Imagine the courage it would take to stand against the might of the most powerful military regime in Japan. To stand tall when the weight of history seems to be against you, when the enemy outnumbers you, when the chances of victory seem so slim. The rebels of Shimabara fought not for land or wealth, but for the right to live, for the right to believe. What could be more powerful than a people driven by faith? But what happens when that faith faces the crushing weight of the shogunate's military power? What happens when belief is tested by the empire's iron fist and everything seems lost? Can faith alone ever be enough to defeat the overwhelming force of a state that seeks to silence you? And yet, in this story, the true battle is not just against the shogunate's army, but against something far deeper, the sacrifice of one's own soul. The moment the rebels raised their spears and marched toward the gates of power, they knew they were fighting not just for freedom, they were fighting for their right to exist, to worship without fear, to believe without persecution. This is where their story takes a turn, where faith and survival become intertwined. The very idea of resistance becomes something more, an act of defiance against a regime that seeks to erase not just their bodies, but their spirits. Will they succeed in their struggle for freedom? Or will they be crushed under the weight of an empire that demands total submission? Before we venture deeper into the heart of this rebellion, where the stakes are nothing short of life and death, let me take a moment to ask you, if you find yourself drawn to stories of faith, resistance, and the human spirit's capacity to endure, hit that like button now. Subscribe and share this video with those who believe in the power of untold stories. Trust me, this is one journey you won't want to miss. It's a story that will challenge you to think, to question, and perhaps even to re-examine what it means to stand for something greater than yourself. We're about to step into a world where small acts of rebellion became the flashpoint for a nation's soul. In the quiet corners of Shimabara, far removed from the eyes of the capital, a group of rebels would rise to challenge the power of the Tokugawa Shogunate. a power so immense that it seemed unstoppable. But what these rebels lacked in numbers and resources, they made up for with faith. Their battle wasn't fought with just swords and spears, it was fought with their hearts and souls, their very belief in the rightness of their cause. This isn't just a story about a battle. It's a story about the power of belief, about how one's faith can ignite resistance against an overwhelming force, about how ordinary people can become heroes when they are driven by something greater than themselves. Theirs is a battle of identity and freedom, a battle fought not with brute force, but with the strength of their convictions. As we follow the journey of one brave soul from the Shimabara Rebellion, we'll not only witness the external struggle against the shogunate, but also the internal battle they face, the struggle between duty to their people, loyalty to their faith, and the ever-present fear of what they might lose in the name of their belief. But before we dive into their story, where the ultimate cost of this rebellion will be revealed, take a moment. If you believe in the strength of the human spirit and the power of belief to overcome even the greatest of obstacles, don't forget to smash that like button, subscribe to stay updated, and share this video with your fellow explorers of history. You won't want to miss the journey that's about to unfold. We're about to walk down the bloodied streets of Shimabara, where the brave souls who fought for their faith didn't just challenge the Tokugawa Shogunate, they challenged an empire that sought to erase their very identity. Will they find redemption in the face of certain defeat, or will they be consumed by the firestorm they ignited? Will the flame of their faith burn bright enough to inspire future generations, or will it be extinguished under the crushing weight of a monolithic empire? This is where their story begins, not as rebels, but as men and women of faith. Driven to the edge by a system that demanded obedience, their rebellion was born out of the belief that freedom and belief were worth fighting for, no matter the cost. Join me as we step into their shoes, understand their sacrifice, feel their pain, and witness their courage as they fight for the most sacred right a person can have, the right to believe without fear. The day was gray, heavy with the weight of unspoken fears and whispers of impending danger. The air smelled of wet earth and salt, the winds of the Shimabara Peninsula carrying with them the scent of the sea. It was a place of great natural beauty, rolling hills covered in lush greenery, a serene village tucked against the coastline, but for Kiyoshi and his family, it felt like a place trapped between two worlds. On one side, there was the land they had known all their lives, small, peaceful, and bound by the rhythms of nature. Their home was simple, yet it was their own. The village was a close-knit community, one where neighbors knew each other's names, and the days passed slowly, marked by the quiet hum of everyday life. But on the other side, there was the shadow of the Tokugawa Shogunate, looming over them, a constant reminder that their faith had made them enemies in their own homeland. Christianity, which had once been welcomed by a few, was now an unforgivable crime. To believe in God, to practice the faith that they held so dear, was now to be seen as an act of rebellion. For Kiyoshi, the dichotomy was suffocating. There was a peace in their simple life, but there was also a sense of fear that hung in the air like a cloud. Fear of what the shogunate would do to them if they were discovered. Fear of the persecution that had already come to their door, knocking on the homes of their fellow Christians. He sat on the low wooden bench inside his small home, his hands resting on his lap, his mind adrift in the quiet hum of evening. The low murmur of the village outside filtered through the thin walls of their home, blending with the soft rustle of the bamboo trees just beyond the door. But beneath this stillness lay a tension that never quite left. It was the oppressive weight of fear, of knowing that at any moment the shogunate soldiers could arrive, demanding their loyalty, demanding they renounce their faith. For months, rumors had been swirling in the community, rumors of raids, of priests executed in the town square, of hidden Christians dragged out from their homes and forced to confess or face the sword. Kiyoshi's mother, Eiko, bent over the hearth, carefully stirring the rice with a wooden spoon. Her movements were steady, but there was a tension in her posture, an edge of concern in the way she handled the pot. Mika, his younger sister, sat nearby, playing quietly with a simple wooden doll. It was a piece that felt too fragile, too temporary in a world where nothing was ever guaranteed. "Kiyoshi," his mother said, breaking the silence, her voice soft but laced with a subtle urgency. "Did you hear the news today?" Kiyoshi didn't answer immediately. His mind had already traveled far beyond the village, beyond the comforting smell of rice and herbs. He had heard the rumors another Christian had been executed. The shogunate soldiers had found him hiding in the mountains. They hadn't even given him a chance to repent. They'd burned him alive in front of a crowd to make an example. "I heard," Kiyoshi said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of sorrow and anger. "How many more must die before it ends, Mother?" His mother's hands paused for a moment, the spoon hovering over the pot. Then, with a heavy sigh, she returned to stirring. "The shogunate will never be satisfied, Kiyoshi. They will hunt us until we are all gone. But we cannot abandon our faith. That is what they want. They want us to give up, to deny our God. But we must stand firm." Kiyoshi stood up from the bench, his eyes distant as he walked toward the small window that overlooked the village. He could see the rising smoke from the hearths of other homes, the flickering light of life carrying on, oblivious to the constant threat hanging over them. But Kiyoshi felt trapped, as though the walls were closing in on him. He had always known this life would come with sacrifice, but the cost seemed too high now. "Why does it have to be this way?" Kiyoshi muttered to himself, his hands clenched at his sides. "We've never hurt anyone. We've only followed the teachings of Christ. Why should we have to hide?" His mother stood behind him now, her hand gently resting on his shoulder. She was no longer the calm, steady figure she once was. Her eyes were tired, the weight of years of suffering weighing heavily on her shoulders. "We must endure, my son. Faith is our shield, and God is our strength. But even our faith has its price. Look at the cross by the door. What did it cost Christ? It cost him everything." Kiyoshi turned toward his mother, his eyes meeting hers for the first time in what felt like an eternity. His thoughts were a blur, anger, fear, sorrow, but beneath it all, something else simmered. Fear was a constant companion, but so was faith, a faith that kept him going even when the world felt on the verge of collapse. "But how long, Mother?" Kiyoshi's voice cracked, the weight of their situation finally breaking through. "How long must we hide, live in fear? How many more must die before this ends?" Eiko looked down, her eyes heavy with grief. "As long as it takes, Kiyoshi. until we stand before God. That night, as Kiyoshi lay on his thin mat, the darkness of the room seemed to swallow him whole. The small cottage, usually a place of warmth and comfort, felt suffocating, its walls closing in as though the night itself were pressing against him, urging him to give up. His mother's words echoed in his mind. Until we stand before God. The simplicity of her faith, her unwavering resolve, had always been his anchor. But tonight it felt distant, like a distant star flickering weakly in the vast, overwhelming night sky. But was that enough? Could his faith truly sustain him through the depths of persecution they were facing? Could it give him the strength to stand firm when the whole world seemed to demand his submission? He had always believed that faith was a shield, something that could keep him standing, no matter what the enemy threw at him. But now, as the shogunate soldiers closed in, he wasn't sure anymore. Faith had kept him going this far, but at what cost? How long could they keep going, hiding, waiting for the next raid, the next punishment, the next person to be executed for believing in a different God? His thoughts swirled, tangled, and jumbled in his mind as his fingers gripped the edges of his blanket. The weight of the world seemed to press down on him, every breath a labor, every thought heavy. He wasn't just thinking about his own survival anymore. It wasn't just about him, or his family, or the rebels around him. No, now it was about the sacrifice, the many lives lost, and the possibility of losing even more in the name of faith. How many more of us will die? Kiyoshi thought bitterly, closing his eyes against the tears that threatened to come. How long until they find us all? The village was a breeding ground for fear now. The whispers of betrayal and persecution never far from their hearts. He thought of his friends, his family, the others who had been forced to live in secret, hiding behind walls and locked doors, pretending to be something they weren't in order to survive. The Tokugawa Shogunate soldiers had been relentless, hunting down Christians wherever they could find them. The faith they had once practiced in peace had become their crime, their curse. The last few months had felt like a series of slow, inevitable steps towards some dreadful end that none of them could escape. And yet, in the midst of his doubt and fear, there was something else, something new, something that stirred deep within him. It wasn't the familiar urge to survive, it was something much stronger, something different. It was a voice, a whisper, that called him to do more than just survive. It was the desire to fight back, to resist, to take a stand for something that was far greater than his own life, greater than just escaping the shogunate's wrath. He wasn't just fighting to stay alive. He wasn't just fighting for his people, for his family, his friends, or the community that had shared his faith. No, this was bigger. It was about preserving their identity, their soul, their right to exist as they had chosen to. They had fought not just for survival, but for freedom. They fought because they refused to be erased. To deny their faith, their right to believe, would be to give up everything they had ever stood for. As his sister, Mika, turned over in her sleep, her small form huddled against the wall, Kiyoshi made a quiet promise to himself. He couldn't remain passive. He couldn't just sit idly by, waiting for death to come. The more he thought about it, the more he realized that waiting for their inevitable end would not honor their faith or the sacrifices they had already made. His heart clenched at the thought of his family, of Mika, and the fear that one day she too would be caught in the shogunate's grasp. But he couldn't let fear hold him anymore. He couldn't let the death of others mean nothing. Kiyoshi couldn't die without fighting for the very thing that made life worth living: faith, freedom, and the right to believe. In the stillness of the night, Kiyoshi lay motionless, staring up at the ceiling. The familiar weight of his spear, the weapon he had carried throughout the rebellion, seemed light now, as though it had become something more than just an instrument of defense. It was a symbol, a call to action. His faith had always been his shield, but now it would become his weapon. He made a quiet vow in his heart. He would not simply wait for death to come. He would fight, not out of hatred, but for the very belief that had shaped his life. He would fight for his people, but more importantly, he would fight for the truth of his faith, even if it meant losing everything. Kiyoshi knew this was not a fight he could win through strength alone. The shogunate's army was too powerful, their numbers too vast. But their faith, his faith, was something that could never be defeated by the sword. It was something that could transcend death, could live on in stories, in whispers, in the hearts of those who came after them. The shogunate could destroy their bodies, but they could never destroy their spirit. He would go down fighting, standing firm in the belief that what they had fought for was more valuable than their own lives. It was the sacrifice of faith that Kiyoshi had come to understand, the sacrifice that his family and friends had embraced even before him. Their belief was the legacy that would carry them forward, even when they were gone. Kiyoshi lay there, his body heavy but his heart lightened by this new resolve. The winds outside stirred the bamboo trees once more, the soft rustling of their leaves a calming whisper. His mind drifted back to the cross his mother had placed by the door, the same cross that had become a symbol of resistance, of their unwavering faith. It was more than just wood, it was a sign of everything they stood for. "No matter what comes," Kiyoshi whispered, his voice firm despite the fear that still lingered in his chest. "We will stand. We will fight for what is right." His resolve, once shaky and uncertain, had become something he could no longer ignore. Kiyoshi could see it now. The purpose of his life had always been more than just survival. It had always been about fighting for the right to believe, for the right to exist without fear, without the oppression of a regime that demanded his subjugation. He closed his eyes for a moment, peace settling in his chest. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew that the fight for freedom would not end with them. It was just beginning. When the first light of dawn broke through the small window of the cottage, Kiyoshi stood up. He could hear the faint murmur of the village waking, the sound of children playing, the life that continued despite the threat of death hanging over them. His heart felt lighter now, no longer burdened by the weight of indecision. He would fight for the life they had known, for the faith they could not abandon, and for the future they could still shape. With one last look at the small, quiet corner where Mika slept, Kiyoshi made his way out the door. The rebellion had begun, and his role in it had never been clearer. The road ahead would be filled with sacrifice, but it would also be a road that led toward something greater than survival. It would lead toward a future where faith, no matter the cost, would never be extinguished. The next morning, a familiar knock on the door broke the morning silence. It was Taro, an old family friend and fellow Christian. Taro had been one of the first to teach Kiyoshi about the faith as a child, and his presence always brought a sense of comfort. But today, his face was grim. "There's talk of raids," Taro said, in a low voice as he entered. "The shogunate's soldiers are getting closer. I've heard whispers that they plan to round up all the Christians in the region and execute anyone who refuses to renounce their faith." Kiyoshi felt a chill run down his spine. Renounce their faith, it was the same thing he had heard time and time again. To renounce meant to live, but at what cost? To deny the God they had trusted in all their life. "We need to make a decision," Taro continued, looking directly at Kiyoshi. "We can't stay hidden forever. It's only a matter of time before they find us." Kiyoshi turned to his mother, who stood in the doorway. Her face was set, as though the decision had already been made in her heart. "We will stay, Taro," she said firmly. "We will not run. We will not hide. God will guide us." Taro's expression softened, but there was a quiet sorrow in his eyes. "Then we must prepare," he said. "Prepare for whatever comes. The shogunate won't show mercy." Kiyoshi's heart pounded in his chest, each beat a reminder of the burden he now carried. The decision had been made, and with it, the path forward was clear, but the weight of it was overwhelming. He had chosen to stand with the rebellion, to fight, to risk everything. But with that choice came an unshakable truth. He was no longer just a son, or a brother, or a simple peasant. He was part of something much bigger, a movement driven by faith and a desperate hope. And though it had brought them to this point, that very faith now felt fragile. Fragile in the face of an enemy so much greater than themselves. The quiet life he had once known, the life of farming, of family meals by the hearth, of laughter echoing through the small village, seemed like a distant memory, slipping through his fingers like grains of sand. That life had been one of simplicity, a world governed by the natural rhythms of the seasons, where each day was marked by the rising and setting of the sun, and the faith he held had been shared in the privacy of their small home. But now, everything had changed. The peaceful existence he had taken for granted had been replaced by this constant battle, this fight for survival, a war that seemed to have no end, no escape. The sweet scent of freshly plucked rice from the fields had been replaced by the smoke of burning villages, the sound of marching boots instead of children's laughter, and the relentless weight of fear that had begun to seep into every corner of their lives. Kiyoshi closed his eyes, but the image of the rebellion's fight wouldn't fade. The memories of the battles, the faces of the fallen comrades, and the mounting cost of their cause filled his mind. He had always known that their life was one of sacrifice, but never had the cost seemed so high. He felt the cold night air seep into the small room where he lay, the blanket offering little warmth against the deep chill of the uncertainty that now gripped him. The silence around him felt like a pressure, like the world was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. He could hear the distant whispers of his fellow villagers, his friends and family, speaking in hushed tones, wondering what would come next. And though he knew they had made their choice, he couldn't shake the feeling that this path, this battle, had cost them more than he was prepared to pay. How long must we live in fear? Kiyoshi thought, his breath slow and shallow. The thought was heavy, like an anchor pulling him under. How long must they hide in the shadows, always looking over their shoulder, always knowing that one misstep would bring the wrath of the shogunate down upon them. How many more sacrifices will we make before this ends? His mind spun with the weight of the question, and yet he knew deep down that it wasn't just about survival anymore. It wasn't just about living to see another day. They had passed that threshold a long time ago. It was about something bigger, something deeper. But even in the midst of the doubt, a new fire burned within him. A fire that said no matter the cost, they would not surrender. His soul, though weary and worn, still carried a deep sense of purpose. They had come too far. Their faith had brought them this far, and though the road ahead seemed impossible, Kiyoshi could not allow himself to falter. He could not let the sacrifice of his friends, of Kiyoshi and the others, be in vain. As the cool wind whispered through the cracks in the walls, Kiyoshi made a quiet promise to himself. His heart, though heavy, began to steady. The fear that had gripped him so intense in the hours before began to recede, replaced with a quiet resolve. He would not face this battle as a passive participant. He had made the choice to fight, and in that choice lay the seeds of determination that would carry him forward. Kiyoshi turned onto his side, the weight of the blanket heavy across his chest, and stared into the darkness. His faith had always been his anchor. It had seen him through the quiet days of farming, through the struggles of hidden worship, and now it was his shield in the face of overwhelming odds. It was the only thing he had left that couldn't be taken from him. "I will not falter," Kiyoshi whispered to himself, the words soft but firm. "We will stand firm. We must." The rebellion was no longer just a fight for survival. It had become a fight for meaning, for identity, for the right to live freely, and to believe without the shogunate's iron fist around their throats. Kiyoshi knew this wasn't just about defeating the Tokugawa. It was about standing for what they believed in, no matter the cost. As the days stretched on, and the shogunate's forces grew nearer, Kiyoshi felt the growing weight of his own responsibility. No longer could he hide behind his father's words or his community's quiet defiance. He had to step forward into the storm, into the fire. The time for fear and doubt had passed. He would stand firm, not just for himself, but for the future. For the future of those who had suffered in silence. For the future of his sister Mika, whose innocent face had been the last thing he thought of before each battle. He knew that their fight was a battle not just for the present, but for a world that would be shaped by their resilience. And though the odds were against them, though the Tokugawa Shogunate would never relent, Kiyoshi felt the strength of his faith rise within him. They would not surrender. His decision was clear now. They would stand firm, no matter what the cost. The days in Shimabara had grown darker, more oppressive with every passing week. Word of the shogunate's raid spread like wildfire, carried by the whispers of the fearful. It seemed there was no place to hide. The Christians in the village kept their heads down, but the silence was deafening, like a storm waiting to break. Kiyoshi had long wondered what it would take for the people to rise, for the injustice to become unbearable enough for action. But every time he asked himself, he thought, what could we do? They were just peasants, ordinary people, without the means to challenge an empire. Still, there were rumors in the village, whispers of a rebellion, murmured among trusted friends, small groups gathering secretly to speak of a fight. It was a hopeful spark, But Kiyoshi had heard it all before. The idea of fighting back seemed too distant, too dangerous, but he couldn't help but be drawn to the words he overheard. The rain had been relentless for the past few days. It was the kind of storm that numbed the senses, leaving the village cold and damp, the air thick with the smell of earth and wet wood. But it wasn't just the weather that left Kiyoshi with an unsettled feeling. It was the weight of fear that had begun to settle over everyone. His heart had grown heavy, and the feeling of hopelessness seemed to swallow him whole. As he stood outside in the rain, staring out at the vast expanse of green before him, a figure approached from the corner of the field. Taro, his old friend. "Kiyoshi, come inside," Taro called through the rain, his voice strained with urgency. "There's something you need to hear." Kiyoshi followed Taro into the small shack where a group of villagers had gathered. The atmosphere was tense, and a feeling of restless anticipation filled the air. As soon as he stepped inside, Kiyoshi saw that the faces around the room were all too familiar: neighbors, family, and even priests who had once preached in secret. In the corner, a man stood, speaking quietly but with the kind of authority that demanded attention. "This is Brother Ichiro," Taro said, his voice soft but carrying an edge of excitement. "He's one of the missionaries who's been hiding among us." And Brother Ichiro was not like the local priest, who had long since been silenced by the Tokugawa. He was young, his face marked with a mixture of exhaustion and determination, but his eyes shone with a fiery conviction. "Brothers and sisters," Ichiro began, his voice cutting through the murmur of the room, "the time has come. We cannot continue to hide, not in silence, not in fear. We must fight back. The shogunate has given us no choice. If we wait for them to come for us, we will be wiped out. If we do not act, we will lose everything: our faith, our people, and the right to live as free men." The room fell into still silence as Ichiro's words sunk in. For a long time, Kiyoshi had believed that survival was about remaining quiet, about hiding their faith to stay alive. But what Ichiro said struck something deep inside him. What was survival if it meant sacrificing everything that made him who he was? "We fight with our faith," Ichiro continued, his voice low but steady. "We fight for the right to worship in the open, to live free of the shogunate's oppression. The way is not easy, and we may lose our lives, but we cannot continue in this shadow. We cannot let them crush us. We must rise." Kiyoshi felt a chill run down his spine. His heart raced, but his mind was still uncertain. He glanced around at the faces of those gathered, all watching, waiting for someone to speak up. His gaze landed on his mother, Eiko, who had always taught him to endure, to survive, no matter the cost. Her eyes met his for a brief moment, but her expression was unreadable. "I've seen enough." Kiyoshi's voice broke the silence. "I've seen the cruelty of their ways. I've seen my own people tortured, killed, all for nothing. I've lived in the shadows, but now we face something far worse than fear. We face loss of everything we hold dear. But is fighting the answer?" A murmur passed through the group, but Ichiro stepped forward, his voice calm. "We've lost so much already. You've seen it, Kiyoshi. You've seen what happens when we remain silent, when we hide and wait for the inevitable. This is our moment. It's not just about survival, it's about fighting for what we believe in. Endeavorly, Kiyoshi felt his chest tighten, torn between the desire to protect his family and the stirring call to rise. Could they really stand against the might of the Tokugawa Shogunate? Could they fight for their faith when it seemed like such an impossible task? He turned to his mother, looking for some guidance. But instead of the usual caution he expected from her, he saw something else in her eyes. A quiet resignation, yes, but also a flicker of hope. A silent approval that perhaps, just perhaps, it was time. I don't know what the future holds, Kiyoshi, Eiko spoke softly. But what I do know is that we cannot remain hidden forever. Our faith has carried us this far, and perhaps it will carry us further. But if you choose this path, know that you choose it with your heart. Her words were simple, but they cut to the core. Kiyoshi had always followed his heart, but now his heart was caught between the weight of his faith and the fear of failure. I will fight, Kiyoshi said, his voice growing steadier, more confident with each word. We've lost too much already. We will fight for freedom and for the right to worship without fear. The room erupted into whispers, but Ichiro raised his hand to quiet them. Then let us stand together as brothers and sisters in faith, he said. We may be few, but we are strong, and we will show the shogunate what it means to challenge the spirit of the people. As the meeting ended, Kiyoshi stepped outside, the cold air of the evening biting at his skin. The rain had stopped, and the sky was clear, with only the occasional dark cloud moving across the horizon. Kiyoshi took a deep breath, feeling the weight of his decision settling in his bones. This was it. He had taken the first step toward the rebellion, and there would be no turning back. His mother's words echoed in his mind. If you choose this path, know that you choose it with your heart. He couldn't be silent anymore. He couldn't hide in the shadows, hoping for peace that would never come. The time to act was now. As he walked back to his family's house, Kiyoshi's mind raced. He didn't know what the future held, but one thing was certain: he had made his choice. He would fight. He would stand with the others who had chosen to rise, no matter the cost. The rebellion was just beginning, and Kiyoshi knew that their fight would be long, hard, and full of sacrifices. But it was a fight worth taking on. It was a fight for their faith, for their freedom, and for their very survival. And as he entered his home, he found his mother waiting. Her quiet acceptance told him that she understood, just as he did that sometimes. The price of faith was everything. The early morning mist had begun to lift over the hills of Shimabara, but the tension that hung in the air was thick and suffocating. It wasn't just the dampness of the soil beneath their feet or the chill of the wind. It was the growing sense that change was imminent, and with it, violence. Kiyoshi stood in the fields, watching his fellow rebels as they practiced with makeshift weapons: bamboo spears, wooden staffs, and the occasional rusty blade they'd found from past battles. They weren't trained soldiers, and there was no cavalry to back them. But their faith was their most powerful weapon. Every strike, every parry, every movement was fueled by the belief that they were fighting for something greater than themselves. The rebellion wasn't just about survival. It wasn't simply about defying the shogunate. It was about protection, the protection of their beliefs, their community, and their right to live without the constant threat of persecution. The Tokugawa's iron grip had reached far, but in Shimabara, the fire of resistance was beginning to burn brighter. Kiyoshi stood with the others, feeling the weight of the training pressing on him. The battle ahead would not be an easy one. The Tokugawa army was a force unlike any other, and they would come down on them with everything they had. "Focus, Kiyoshi!" Taro shouted from across the field, his voice sharp. "Your stance is too weak. Hold it firm, like the foundation of your faith." And Kiyoshi straightened, raising his bamboo spear. He felt the strength in his arms, but his mind was far from the battlefield. His thoughts kept drifting back to the question that haunted him since he first decided to join the rebellion. Is violence the answer? He had grown up learning the ways of peace, learning that faith was about humility, compassion, and forgiveness. But what good was compassion when the very people you loved were being murdered, tortured, and silenced by an empire that cared nothing for their beliefs? Kiyoshi had seen it happen. He had watched it unfold before his very eyes. The shogunate's cruelty knew no bounds. Yet, in his heart, he still questioned, is this the way to fight? The ground felt like it was shifting beneath him. His faith was being tested in ways he had never imagined. Was it wrong to pick up a weapon to defend what he believed? Was violence the price of freedom? And if they won, what would they become? Personal conflict. Later that evening, as the village settled into a heavy silence, Kiyoshi sat alone by the fire, his thoughts a tangle of doubt and desperation. He stared into the flames, watching the orange glow flicker and dance, as if reflecting the turmoil inside his chest. "Kiyoshi?" Eiko's voice was soft, but there was a quiet strength in it. She appeared at the edge of the firelight, her face etched with the wisdom of years spent in quiet suffering. "What's troubling you, son?" He didn't immediately respond. Instead, he looked up at her, as if searching for answers in her face. She had always been his rock, the one who held their family together, the one who never wavered. But even she had seen the cost of their beliefs. Even she had been forced to choose between faith and survival. "Mother," Kiyoshi began, his voice barely above a whisper, "is it wrong? Is it wrong to fight? To take up arms in the name of our faith?" Aiko knelt beside him, her hand resting gently on his shoulder. "My son," she began, her voice filled with the quiet wisdom of someone who had walked this path before. "To fight does not mean to lose your soul. We are defending what is sacred. We are fighting for the right to worship, for the right to believe without fear. God gave us this life, but He also gave us the strength to protect it." Kiyoshi looked down, his heart heavy. "But what happens to us, Mother, if we win? Will we still be the same? Is there a cost to this kind of victory? Will we still be the people we once were? Or will we become the very thing we fought against?" Eiko's hand squeezed his shoulder. "Sometimes, son, to protect the ones you love, you must first become someone else. There is no peace without sacrifice. But faith, true faith, will carry you through." Her words settled over him like a cloak of understanding. He knew the path forward would not be easy, but there was no turning back now. He had chosen this fight, and with it, he had chosen to face the very depths of his own soul. A haiku of doubt and resolve. As Kiyoshi sat in quiet contemplation that night, His thoughts were consumed with the weight of his decision. His hand reached for the piece of paper and ink he kept hidden, a small space where he could put his feelings into words. He scribbled a haiku, a brief but powerful reflection on his internal turmoil. In the flames I stand, yet the fire questions me still. Is this path of peace? He paused after writing the final line, staring at the words. Peace, the very word seemed like a distant memory, something unattainable in the world they lived in now. Yet, Kiyoshi knew that peace was not something that could be given, it was something that had to be fought for. And in that moment, he knew that the fight was not just for survival, it was for the right to exist, to keep faith alive, even in the face of an empire that wished to erase it. The rebels' determination. The next morning, the training intensified. Kiyoshi and the others practiced long into the day, their muscles aching, their minds filled with the knowledge that the time to act was fast approaching. Every movement of their hands with bamboo and steel was more than just a physical exercise. It was a statement. It was a promise to each other and to their faith that they would not be silenced. Ichiro, the leader of the resistance, gathered them around. His face was etched with the weight of command, his eyes unwavering despite the uncertainty that loomed over them all. This is not just a fight for survival, Ichiro said, his voice carrying the weight of conviction. This is a fight for our souls, for everything we have fought to preserve. We may not have the armies of the shogunate, but we have something greater, the will to stand together. And that, my friends, is what will see us through. And Kiyoshi's heart stirred with a renewed sense of purpose. He stood tall, his gaze fixed on Ichiro, his faith steadying his resolve. He wasn't just fighting for himself, he was fighting for his family, his faith, and every person who had suffered under the shogunate's rule. The night before the battle, the Shimabara village seemed eerily quiet, the heavy humidity of the storm still clinging to the air. The rebels had spent the past week strategizing and preparing, but Kiyoshi felt the gnawing uncertainty that lingered at the back of his mind. He wasn't a soldier, he had never been trained for war. His hands, once accustomed to working the soil, now gripped the wooden spear that had become a symbol of their resistance. Inside the small rebel encampment, a fire flickered in the distance, casting long shadows across the faces of the rebels. There was no grand battle plan here. No flanking maneuvers or military tactics learned from years of training. This was simply the will to survive. The villagers and farmers had gathered with only a few weapons, some armed with spears, others with bows, and a handful with swords that had been hidden away for years. Kiyoshi's mind raced as he stared at the fire. He had heard the stories the shogunate soldiers were ruthless, their military tactics precise and deadly. But the villagers, armed only with their faith, were determined. Still, fear gnawed at him. What if they failed? What if they were crushed before they had even begun? The sound of footsteps approached, and Kiyoshi turned to see Taro, his old family friend, walking toward him, his face grim but steady. "Taro," Kiyoshi said quietly, his voice barely audible over the sound of the wind. "What if we're not enough? What if we can't win?" Taro placed a hand on Kiyoshi's shoulder, offering a smile that was both reassuring and laden with the weight of experience. "We may not have the numbers, Kiyoshi, but we have faith, And as long as we believe in what we're fighting for, we'll never be defeated. God doesn't give us this strength to lose. We fight for justice, for freedom, for our right to exist as we are. That's something no army can take from us. Embry, Kiyoshi nodded, but the fear was still there. He was about to go into battle, not as a trained warrior, but as a man driven by belief. Could that really be enough? As dawn broke over the horizon, the air was thick with tension and anticipation. The rebels had gathered just outside the village, watching the Tokugawa army approach in the distance, their armor glinting in the early light. They were an imposing sight, a wall of steel and discipline, while the rebels, ragtag and untrained, stood in their path with makeshift weapons and determined hearts. Kiyoshi stood among them, his hand gripping the spear with sweaty palms. His sister, Mika, was nowhere to be seen, hidden away for safety, as promised by their mother. His mother, though, stood at the far side of the camp, speaking quietly with a few others. She had always been the steady hand, the one who held their family together through the hardest of times. But today, she was silent, her expression unreadable. "We stand strong, Kiyoshi," Taro said, his voice steady as he adjusted his grip on his spear. "This is our time. This is the moment." But even with Taro's words ringing in his ears, Kiyoshi's heart pounded as the Tokugawa soldiers advanced. His legs felt heavy, his breath shallow. He had never been in battle, never felt the weight of life or death on his shoulders. The stakes had never been so high. As the soldiers closed in, he could hear the crunch of their armor and feel the tremor in the ground as their march shook the earth beneath them. The world seemed to slow down, the noise of battle fading as his thoughts raced. Then the order came, "Charge!" The clash was sudden, violent, and relentless. Kiyoshi's heart lurched as he ran forward. The sound of the Tokugawa soldiers' clashing swords and yelling soldiers ringing in his ears. The rebels rushed toward them, the weight of their makeshift weapons a stark contrast to the Tokugawa's polished blades. Kiyoshi swung his spear awkwardly, feeling the weight of the unfamiliar weapon, but the movement felt almost instinctual, like something deep inside him was pushing him forward. The first clash was a blur. There was no time to think, only to react. Kiyoshi's spear met a soldier's sword with a clash that sent shockwaves up his arm. For a moment, he thought he might collapse under the weight of fear, but he didn't. He pushed back, using his faith as strength. A rebel beside him screamed as he was struck down, and Kiyoshi's heart raced, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Were they going to lose? The sight of the Tokugawa soldiers, well-trained, disciplined, and merciless, was enough to make any man hesitate. Yet, as Kiyoshi fought, there was something undeniable in his chest, something that told him he had to keep going. This wasn't just about survival anymore. This was about fighting for something greater. "For freedom!" Taro shouted, his voice cutting through the chaos. The rebels around him echoed the cry, "For freedom!" Despite the odds, there was something powerful in the sound of that cry, something that lit a fire in Kiyoshi's heart. He wasn't just a peasant anymore. He was part of something larger. His faith made him strong. Their cause was just. But in the back of his mind, fear lingered. Would this be enough? The rebels had no armor, no proper weapons. The Tokugawa forces were like an unstoppable wave crashing down on them. The battle raged around him, his spear clashing with one soldier after another. But his mind kept circling back to one thought. What if they lose? Then, something unexpected happened. In the midst of the chaos, the rebels managed to capture a strategic position, the Tokugawa's supply wagon. It was a small victory, a symbolic one, but it was enough to turn the tide. Kiyoshi and Taro had fought their way toward the wagon, where they saw a group of Tokugawa soldiers struggling to defend it. With a coordinated strike, the rebels overwhelmed the soldiers, seizing the wagon and the supplies within. The victory sent a ripple through the rebels' ranks. "We did it!" Taro shouted, his voice filled with disbelief and excitement. Kiyoshi stood frozen for a moment, the weight of the victory sinking in. He had won, they had won. It was small, it was unsteady, but it was a victory nonetheless. The rebels had proven they could fight, and for the first time, Kiyoshi felt something stir inside him, purpose. He looked around, catching sight of his fellow rebels who had been fighting with everything they had. The shouts of victory spread through the ranks, and even the Tokugawa soldiers seemed momentarily shaken. They weren't invincible. The rebellion could succeed if they fought together. But even in the midst of this fleeting joy, Kiyoshi couldn't escape the nagging doubt. What would happen next? The battle was not over, and the victory they had claimed today could be erased tomorrow by the sheer weight of the shogunate's military might. "We have a chance now, Kiyoshi." Taro grinned, clapping him on the back. "This is just the beginning." Kiyoshi forced a smile, but the weight of their next steps was never far from his mind. Victory in this moment felt sweet, but it was uncertain, and the road ahead was still filled with fear, violence, and sacrifice. Still, in the quiet after the battle, as Kiyoshi stood amidst the smoke and the rubble, something had changed within him. He wasn't just a man fighting for survival anymore. He was part of a movement, a rebellion, a cause that would see them through the dark days ahead. This first victory had not just been against the Tokugawa Shogunate, it had been against the fear that had held him back. And as the rebels stood victorious, Kiyoshi knew one thing was certain. They were in this together. And together, they would face whatever came next. The night had come, and with it, a haunting stillness that permeated the air around Shimabara Castle. The once peaceful village, nestled at the foot of the castle, now felt like a battleground awaiting its reckoning. The rebels, hardened by the skirmishes and small victories they had fought through, had now turned their attention to something far more daunting: the siege. The Tokugawa army was closing in, and the castle, the last bastion of their resistance, was their only hope. But hope seemed thin, barely enough to mask the growing fear that gripped Kiyoshi's heart. The rebels had fortified the castle with wooden barricades, reinforced walls, and any supplies they could scrape together from the surrounding countryside. The work was never-ending, with the sound of hammers and the smell of sweat filling the air as they tried to prepare for the inevitable assault. Tension hung in the air like a storm cloud, each passing hour bringing them closer to the final confrontation with the overwhelming might of the Tokugawa forces. Kiyoshi stood at the outer ramparts of the castle, staring out into the dimming light. The once beautiful landscape, with its lush fields and tranquil horizon, now seemed like a distant memory. His mind wandered to his life, before a life where there were no cries of war, no hunger, no death. His family had lived in peace, working the land, sharing meals together, and praying in the privacy of their humble home. But now, the very land they had worked, the land they had loved, was a place of war, a place of bloodshed. The simple beauty of their existence had been shattered, replaced by a relentless cycle of battle, fear, and survival. Kiyoshi's hand tightened around the wooden spear he had used since the beginning of the rebellion. It had been a simple tool, nothing more than a piece of wood sharpened to a point. But now, it felt heavier, as if it had become a symbol of everything he had lost. His life had turned from a peaceful existence to one dominated by the constant threat of death. "We've made it this far, Kiyoshi." Taro's voice broke through the silence, his footsteps crunching on the gravel behind him. Taro had been a friend of his father's, a man of deep faith and strength, and now a fellow warrior in this fight. His presence brought a sense of familiarity and comfort, but even Taro's unshakable resolve couldn't dispel the growing dread in Kiyoshi's heart. Taro joined Kiyoshi at the rampart, his gaze also fixed on the distance. "But I don't think we can run anymore. This will be the fight that decides it all." Kiyoshi didn't answer immediately. His eyes moved across the horizon, the clouds heavy with rain, as though even the heavens had paused to witness the inevitable conflict. "How did it come to this?" Kiyoshi murmured, his voice low and filled with an aching sorrow. "We were just people trying to live our lives." Taro sighed, his expression hardening. "It was always going to come to this, Kiyoshi. They've hunted us, burned our churches, killed our brothers and sisters. We couldn't hide forever. This is what it means to stand for what we believe in." Kiyoshi's heart tightened at the words, but something lingered in the back of his mind. Was this truly the only way? To pick up weapons and face the might of the shogunate, knowing that in doing so they risked everything? His faith told him that they were fighting for justice, for freedom, but in his heart a whisper of doubt stirred. How many more would die before it was over? What was left to fight for if all that remained were the ruins of a broken world? The sky had darkened as the Tokugawa army drew closer, their marching boots sending a chill down Kiyoshi's spine. The rebels had fortified the castle, huddling together like a small, scattered handful against the might of an overwhelming storm. The air became thick with the stench of impending doom, and the rebel forces, though brave, could do little but wait for the inevitable clash. The castle had been reinforced, but its walls seemed to shrink beneath the weight of the approaching Tokugawa forces. Kiyoshi watched as his fellow villagers and rebels worked tirelessly, nailing boards to reinforce the gates, digging trenches around the perimeter, and preparing what little they had to defend themselves. The scent of sweat and fear clung to the air like a shroud, and the hours stretched on in slow agony. Ichiro, the leader of the rebellion, stood at the front of the gathered rebels, his voice ringing out, full of resolve. "Ready yourselves, brothers and sisters. We stand in the name of justice, in the name of faith. The shogunate has taken everything from us, but they cannot take our souls. God gives us the strength to stand firm in this moment." End verse. Kiyoshi's heart swelled with a sense of determination as he listened to Ichiro's words. There was something infectious about the leader's unwavering belief that the fight was just that no matter what happened, they were in the right. But as Kiyoshi looked around at the faces of his fellow rebels, young men and women, elderly farmers, mothers with children, he couldn't ignore the fear that clouded their expressions. How many of them had experienced battle before? How many of them were truly ready for what was to come? As the hours passed and the final preparations for the siege were made, Kiyoshi found himself alone in a quiet corner of the castle, his spear leaning against the wall. His thoughts were a whirlwind, his heart heavy with uncertainty. The weight of their purpose felt suffocating. How could they possibly stand against such an overwhelming enemy? The Tokugawa forces were disciplined, well-trained, and led by men like Oda Nobutaka, a general known for his ruthlessness and tactical brilliance. Kiyoshi had spent his life cultivating a peaceful existence with his family. His thoughts often drifted back to the days before the rebellion, when there were no cries of war, no raging fires and bodies of fallen soldiers. It had been a life of simplicity and faith, a life where he knew who he was and where his place in the world was clear. But now, everything had changed. The world had been torn asunder by the tides of violence, and faith alone could not bring back the peace they had lost. Kiyoshi, Taro's voice broke through his thoughts, and he turned to find his friend standing at the entrance, his face somber. The soldiers are getting closer. It's only a matter of time before the first attack. And Kiyoshi nodded but didn't rise. His voice was soft, almost hesitant. What if we're wrong, Taro? What if this fight only brings more pain, more bloodshed? What if this is not what we were meant to do? Taro stepped forward, his brow furrowed with concern. What's the alternative? Do we just let the shogunate destroy us? Let them wipe out our families and our faith? Do we let them take everything we believe in and silence us? This is the last stand, Kiyoshi. It's not about winning, it's about standing up for who we are. Do you think your father would have stood by and let this happen? Do you think he would have let them burn our churches and kill our people? Kiyoshi swallowed hard, the weight of Taro's words sinking deep into his chest. His father had always been the pillar of their family, a man of unwavering faith, a man of peace, who had raised him to believe in the goodness of people. Kiyoshi had always been proud to carry his father's teachings. But now, as the weight of the rebellion pressed upon him, he wondered if his father would have been so quick to take up arms. Taro placed a hand on his shoulder, his grip firm but kind. We may never see the peace we once knew, Kiyoshi, but we fight for it. We fight for a future where our children don't have to live in fear. This is the price of faith, and it's the price we have to pay. Kiyoshi met his gaze, the doubt beginning to ebb away. It was as if, in that moment, he finally understood. He wasn't just fighting for freedom or for justice, he was fighting for something far more personal, far more sacred. He was fighting for the future, for a world where faith could flourish without fear. That night, as the moonlight shone down on the castle walls and the sounds of the incoming Tokugawa forces grew louder, Kiyoshi knelt in the small chapel they had built within the castle grounds. A quiet prayer was all he could offer, the words feeling weak against the weight of what was to come. He whispered into the stillness, God, give me strength. Grant us the courage to stand firm, to fight not with hatred, but with faith in what is good. And if it is your will that we fall, may we fall in your grace." The rebel army gathered in the courtyard, their faces set with determination, but their hearts were heavy. They had come so far, but the battle was only just beginning. The siege of Shimabara Castle was about to begin, and with it, Kiyoshi knew that nothing would ever be the same. They would stand their ground, fight with all their might, and pray for a future that had once seemed impossible. But in the back of his mind, the question still lingered. What was the price of faith? Could their belief truly survive the violence they were about to face? The morning sky over Shimabara Castle had darkened with the weight of impending doom. There was no mistaking it. The Tokugawa forces were closing in, an unstoppable tide of steel, discipline, and unrelenting might. The distant rumble of war drums echoed through the air, growing louder with every passing hour, like the heartbeat of an approaching storm. Kiyoshi stood atop the castle's outer ramparts, gazing into the distance where the horizon met the advance of the shogunate army. The landscape, once lush and peaceful, was now filled with the unmistakable signs of a final battle. The vast fields, once fertile and full of life, now seemed barren, like the calm before the storm. The rebels had done everything they could to prepare the castle, fortifying the gates, reinforcing the walls, and setting up booby traps along the perimeter. Every makeshift weapon had been used, every available hand pressed into service, but none of it seemed enough against the crushing force that was coming their way. The Tokugawa soldiers outnumbered them thousands of soldiers, led by Oda Nobutaka, a general with a reputation for mercilessness and brutality. The odds seemed impossible. Kiyoshi could feel the weight of inevitability in his chest. His hand tightened around his wooden spear, the same one he had held through every battle. But now it felt heavier, as if it carried the burden of their sacrifice. The familiar weight of the weapon now reminded him not just of his family's struggle, but of the struggle of every rebel who had taken a stand. "We've made it this far, Kiyoshi." Taro's voice broke through the swirling thoughts in Kiyoshi's mind. The older man's expression was stoic, his face unreadable, but Kiyoshi could see the strain in his eyes. "But I don't think we can run anymore. This will be the fight that decides it all." Kiyoshi turned to face him, his heart heavy. He had seen this moment coming, but nothing could prepare him for the weight of it. "How did it come to this?" Kiyoshi murmured, staring out at the horizon. "We were just people trying to live our lives. We never asked for this." Damn. Taro's gaze softened, and for a brief moment, Kiyoshi saw the sorrow in his eyes. "It was always going to come to this, Kiyoshi. The shogunate has hunted us for years, burned our churches, killed our brothers and sisters. We can't hide forever. This is what it means to stand for what we believe in." The words struck a chord deep within Kiyoshi. He had fought for faith, but now, standing in the shadow of defeat, doubt crept into his mind. He had asked himself again and again, was this the only way? Was violence the price of freedom? Or had they lost something far greater along the way? Kiyoshi's gaze shifted back to the approaching army. Thousands of Tokugawa soldiers, their armor gleaming in the light, were marching steadily toward them. The drums reverberated like the pulse of an army of destruction, a force so great that it seemed almost unnatural. "How long do we hold out?" Kiyoshi whispered, his voice barely audible. "How much longer can we survive this?" Taro's voice was low but firm. "As long as we must." We fight not just for our lives, Kiyoshi, but for what we believe in. Kiyoshi's heart beat painfully in his chest. He looked around at the faces of the rebels who were gathered in the courtyard below. These were ordinary men and women, farmers, mothers, fathers, children who had taken up arms against the most powerful military force in Japan. They had no training, no experience, yet here they stood, ready to face the shogunate. Would their faith be enough? Kiyoshi wondered. The siege begins. The day passed in a blur of preparations. The rebels fortified their positions, setting up barricades at every entrance, digging trenches, and placing booby traps around the castle's perimeter. The faint sounds of the Tokugawa army's approach echoed louder with every passing minute, each beat of their drums signaling the inevitable clash. Inside the castle, the rebel forces gathered in the central courtyard, where Ichiro, their leader, had called them together. His presence was a source of strength for the fighters, his voice like a beacon of hope. We stand as one, brothers and sisters. Ichiro's voice rang out, unwavering and full of resolve. We fight for what's right. The shogunate has taken everything from us, but they cannot take our souls. We will stand firm, with God's strength in our hearts. This is our last stand, but it is not in vain. We fight for the future. Kiyoshi's heart swelled with determination as Ichiro's words echoed through the courtyard. The leader's faith and resolve were infectious. And for a moment, Kiyoshi felt the spark of hope that had carried them through their struggles rise again. But even in that fleeting moment of strength, his thoughts returned to the uncertainty that clung to him like a second skin. Looking around at the faces of his comrades, young men, elderly women, farmers, and mothers, Kiyoshi could feel the weight of fear in the air. The doubt in his heart echoed in their eyes. How many of them had truly fought before? How many of them would make it out of this alive? As the final preparations for the siege were made, Kiyoshi found himself alone in a quiet corner of the castle. The weight of their situation was becoming more oppressive by the minute. The battle was no longer just a fight for survival, it was a fight for everything they had once known. It was the last stand, and in the back of his mind, Kiyoshi couldn't help but ask, what if they were wrong? What if this wasn't the right path? What if there was another way to resist without bloodshed? Could they have kept their faith without the violence, without the death? The sound of footsteps interrupted his thoughts, and Taro appeared at his side. The soldiers are almost here. It's only a matter of time now. Kiyoshi looked up at his friend, the weight of uncertainty still pressing on his chest. What if we're wrong, Taro? What if this isn't what we were meant to do? What if our fight only brings more pain? Taro placed a hand on Kiyoshi's shoulder, his grip firm but full of understanding. What other choice do we have? He said, his voice steady. Do we just let the shogunate destroy us? Let them kill our families, burn our churches? Do we let them wipe away everything we've worked for? Kiyoshi swallowed hard, the truth of Taro's words weighing heavily on him. His father had always taught him to believe in the goodness of humanity. But now, in the face of the shogunate's brutality, he wondered if peace alone would ever be enough. We may never see the peace we once knew, Kiyoshi, Taro continued, his voice softer now. But we fight for it. We fight for the future, for a world where our children don't have to live in fear. And this is the price of faith sometimes. It requires everything. Kiyoshi met Taro's gaze. his resolve slowly building once more. He knew this fight wasn't just about winning, it was about standing for something that would last. For the first time, he felt the weight of responsibility that came with their cause. They were fighting for the future, for a world that would be better, even if they didn't live to see it. The Tokugawa army had reached the castle gates. The sound of horses and clanging armor was deafening now, signaling that the end had arrived. The air crackled with tension as the gates of Shimabara Castle opened, and the Tokugawa forces surged forward like a tide of steel. The rebels met them with every bit of strength they had left, charging into the battle with spears, bamboo swords, and makeshift shields. The clash was inevitable. Kiyoshi's spear met a Tokugawa soldier's sword with a loud clang, but the force behind the soldier's strike was too much. Kiyoshi was knocked back, his breath leaving him in a ragged gasp. The weight of the situation was unbearable. For a moment, he thought it was over, but then a familiar voice rang out through the chaos. "Kiyoshi, fight with us!" It was Taro, leading the charge, his face filled with determination. Kiyoshi's heart surged with new strength. He gritted his teeth and pushed himself up, his resolve firming. His faith was his shield now. The soldiers may have had more numbers, but the rebels had faith, and that was something the shogunate could never take from them. As the battle raged on, Kiyoshi could hear the cries of victory and pain mingling in the air. The rebels had captured the supply wagon, a small victory, but one that gave them a flicker of hope in the overwhelming tide of the Tokugawa army. The momentum shifted slightly in their favor, but the battle was far from over. Kiyoshi's heart raced as he saw his comrades fighting with everything they had, standing firm against the Tokugawa's might. Despite the overwhelming odds, they had proven that they could resist, that they had the will to fight. But even in the midst of the victory, Kiyoshi knew the fight was far from over. The Tokugawa army would return. They were outnumbered, and there was no telling how long they could hold out. But for this moment, they had shown the shogunate that they would not be silenced. And for Kiyoshi, that was enough. The sounds of battle had faded into the distant echoes of destruction. The castle walls, once strong and proud, now lay in ruins. The dust and smoke from the last stand of the rebels hung heavy in the air, mingling with the scent of blood and fire. Kiyoshi stood among the wreckage of the final fight, his legs shaky beneath him, his heart pounding with the weight of everything they had lost. The Tokugawa army had broken through their defenses. The rebels, despite their desperate courage and their unyielding faith, had been overwhelmed. Shimabara Castle, their last stronghold, was no longer a symbol of resistance. It was a graveyard. Around Kiyoshi, the bodies of his fellow rebels lay scattered, their once vibrant dreams of freedom extinguished in the blink of an eye. The final assault had come swiftly. The Tokugawa soldiers, armed with superior numbers, better weapons, and unrelenting discipline, had struck hard and fast. Kiyoshi had fought with all the strength his body could summon, but the weight of the enemy proved too much. Every movement felt slower, every strike weaker. His spear had broken in the chaos, and he had been forced to fight with his bare hands, still unwilling to abandon the fight for the freedom of his people. But now, as he stood in the ruins of the battle, Kiyoshi could feel the crushing weight of defeat settling upon him. The rebel forces were scattered, and many were already being rounded up by the Tokugawa soldiers. The battle cry of the shogunate's army had become a mocking roar of victory, and the rebels were left to face the bitter consequences of their sacrifice. Kiyoshi's eyes scanned the battlefield, taking in the sight of his fallen comrades. The faces of the men and women who had once stood beside him, Taro, Ichiro, and so many others, now lay silent, their dreams of freedom extinguished with their lives. The sound of Tokugawa soldiers marching toward the captured rebels filled the air. It wasn't just a defeat, it was a loss of identity, a crushing blow to everything they had believed in. Kiyoshi had never felt so helpless. His spear was gone, his sword shattered, and his faith was all that remained. But even faith could not protect them from the reality of defeat. The castle that had once been their bastion was now a prison, and the Tokugawa forces would not stop until the last of them was destroyed. "We fought for nothing, Kiyoshi." Taro's voice reached him, weak and broken. The older man had somehow survived the battle, but it was clear that he, too, had come to understand the magnitude of their loss. The resilience that had once burned brightly in Taro's eyes now seemed to have dimmed with the knowledge that their rebellion had ended in ruin. Kiyoshi turned to face Taro, his heart heavy with grief. "We didn't fight for nothing," he said, his voice barely more than a whisper. "We fought for our faith, for the right to worship as we see fit. And if we die, at least we die for something greater than ourselves." "Oh!" Taro's eyes glistened with unshed tears, and for a moment the weight of the battle seemed to overwhelm him. "But will it matter?" he asked quietly, his voice full of sorrow. "Will our sacrifice mean anything? The shogunate will crush us, and nothing will change. Our faith will be buried with us." Kiyoshi looked at the ground, his mind reeling. He had believed so strongly in their cause, but the reality of their defeat was undeniable. Lives had been lost, homes destroyed, and the hope of a free Japan was slipping further out of reach. The Tokugawa soldiers were close now, their steel-clad figures emerging from the smoke like shadows of death. Kiyoshi could see the glint of their weapons, their cold faces, and the iron grip of their military might. They were coming to round up the remaining rebels, to crush the last remnants of resistance. Kiyoshi felt his legs tremble beneath him. He had fought and suffered, but there was no longer any escape. The castle's walls had crumbled, and with it, the hope of victory. He had only one choice left to face the end. He glanced over at Mika, hidden away in the distant shadows of the castle. She was safe, but for how long? He couldn't bear the thought of her being caught by the shogunate's forces, her life reduced to a tool of oppression. "No!" Kiyoshi shouted, shaking off the dread that threatened to consume him. He turned to Taro. "We will not surrender. Not now, not ever. We stand firm as we always have." Taro nodded, but it was clear that he, too, understood the finality of their situation. They would not live to see the dawn. The Tokugawa soldiers drew closer. Kiyoshi could hear their footsteps, the march of the empire that had defeated them. They would take no prisoners. The rebels had been a symbol of defiance, and the shogunate would see them extinguished to make an example of them. Execution, or worse, awaited them. Kiyoshi's heart raced, but his thoughts were clear. He would not die as a slave to the empire. He would die as a martyr, standing firm in the belief that they had fought for something greater than themselves. In his final moments, Kiyoshi turned toward the heavens, the same heavens he had prayed to in the quiet of the village. He knelt before the cross that had always been his symbol of strength and faith. "God, if this is the end," Kiyoshi whispered, his voice trembling but resolute, "I fight for your glory. I fight for the soul of my people. I stand firm in your name, even in the face of death." He could feel the weight of the Tokugawa soldiers closing in, but there was a sense of peace that washed over him. He had fought not for victory, but for something pure, for freedom in the only way that made sense to him. Faith was their shield, and if that was the last thing he had left, he would die defending it. As the Tokugawa soldiers closed in, Kiyoshi stood tall, his eyes clear, his spear raised. He would not fall to his knees and surrender. He would stand tall, even as the end approached. The shogunate would break his body, but they would never break his faith. As Kiyoshi stood ready to face his end, a moment of clarity washed over him. He realized that his life, his struggle, and his faith had all been part of a larger plan. Death was a small price to pay for the truth they had fought for. The Tokugawa soldiers approached. Kiyoshi closed his eyes for a moment, offering a silent prayer, the kind of prayer that had guided him through the darkest of days. When he opened his eyes, he was ready. For freedom, for faith, for everything he had loved, he would die as a man of faith. The aftermath of the Shimabara Rebellion was a grim scene of devastation, both physical and spiritual. The once proud Shimabara castle lay in ruins, its walls shattered, its gates torn open, and the land around it stained with the blood of the brave souls who had fought for something greater than themselves. The battle had been lost, the last stand of the rebels fading into a quiet silence that felt unnatural, a finality that seemed to crush everything in its path. Yet it wasn't just the physical destruction that haunted the survivors. It was the emotional toll, the weight of what had been lost, the sacrifice that seemed to have been in vain. Kiyoshi's death was a heavy presence in the air, a silent echo that reverberated through the ruins of the village, reaching even the farthest corners of the shogunate's retaliations. His name became a whisper among the surviving rebels and villagers, a symbol of everything they had fought for and lost. The Tokugawa soldiers wasted no time in their retaliation. The sound of marching boots was deafening as they poured into the village, their faces cold, their movements precise and unfeeling. The shogunate's forces swept through the wreckage of the castle with brutal efficiency, rounding up the surviving rebels, those few who had managed to escape the initial assault. The soldiers treated them like cattle, shackling them, dragging them through the streets in front of their families. Taro, his clothes torn and his body covered in the marks of battle, stood at the edge of the village, unable to move, his heart heavy with grief. He watched in horror as his comrades, the mothers, the fathers, the brothers and sisters who had fought alongside him, were dragged through the streets. They were reduced to nothing more than criminals, their bodies broken and their spirits crushed by the weight of their defeat. The humiliation of it all was unbearable. Taro wanted to scream, to rush forward and fight back, but there was nothing left to fight for. The rebellion had been lost. The Tokugawa soldiers gathered the survivors, forcing them to kneel before them, demanding they renounce their faith, their beliefs, and the very identity that had driven them to stand against an empire. Those who refused were executed, their bodies left in the streets as a warning to others. The spectacle was horrifying, but it was also an undeniable mark of the shogunate's power, a statement that resistance would not be tolerated. Taro stumbled into the ruined remnants of Kiyoshi's home, his body aching, his heart heavy with grief. The house, once full of laughter, warmth, and life, was now a shadow of what it had been. The only thing that remained was the small wooden cross that Kiyoshi had carried throughout the rebellion. Taro placed a trembling hand on it, feeling the quiet strength of Kiyoshi's sacrifice in the silence of the room. "Kiyoshi," Taro whispered, his voice thick with emotion. The tears he had held back for so long now began to flow freely. "We've lost everything, but your faith, your spirit will never be gone." Kiyoshi's faith had been the heart of the rebellion. His belief had inspired Taro and countless others to take up arms, to stand against an empire that sought to crush them. And though Kiyoshi had fallen, Taro could feel that his sacrifice would never be erased. The fight had not ended, it had only been interrupted. The days following the shogunate's retaliation were marked by brutality. The captured rebels were publicly humiliated, paraded through the streets, forced to renounce their faith under the watchful eyes of the shogunate soldiers. Those who refused were executed. Their bodies were displayed as a warning to any who might dare to challenge the shogunate's authority. The public executions were a chilling reminder of the consequences of defiance, but they also became a symbol of everything the rebels had stood for, everything they had fought for. Despite the savagery of the shogunate's retaliation, there was something undeniable in the aftermath. A quiet resilience began to stir within the hearts of the oppressed. The spirit of defiance that had burned so brightly in Kiyoshi and his comrades could not be extinguished by death or violence. The idea of what they had fought for, freedom, faith, and the right to live as they chose, continued to burn like an ember that had not yet been snuffed out. In the days following the rebellion's fall, Taro became one of the most vocal proponents of keeping the memory of the rebellion alive. The survivors, those few who had not been captured, were scattered across Japan, hiding in the shadows, still determined to keep Kiyoshi's faith alive. One evening, Taro gathered the surviving rebels, those who had fought and lost everything. "We lost this battle," he said, his voice low but steady. "But our cause is not finished. Kiyoshi fought for something greater than us. His sacrifice wasn't for nothing. We will keep his faith alive. We will continue to resist, and we will never forget what we fought for." A murmur of agreement rippled through the group. The survivors, though weary and broken, found new strength in each other's resolve. They knew that the shogunate would continue to pursue them, but they also knew that their faith and determination could not be erased. They would continue to gather in secret, continuing the quiet resistance that had begun in Shimabara. As the years passed, the shogunate's hold on Japan grew tighter, but the legacy of the Shimabara Rebellion lived on. Kiyoshi's name, though not written in the official histories, became synonymous with sacrifice and unshakable faith. It was passed down through whispers among the oppressed, those who remembered the brave souls who had stood against the empire, and those who had given everything for the right to believe. Taro, now an older and more weary man, would often stand in front of the small wooden monument at the site of Kiyoshi's death. The cross Kiyoshi had carried into battle had long since fallen, but Taro had placed a small wooden carving in its place, a symbol of hope, a quiet tribute to the sacrifice made by the rebels. The people of Shimabara would never forget Kiyoshi's faith and the example he had set. The rebellion might have been lost, but Kiyoshi's spirit would never be forgotten. As the Christian community in Japan grew stronger in the years that followed, the rebellion's legacy continued to burn. Even as the shogunate sought to silence them, the defiance of the rebels lived on in the shadows. Kiyoshi's martyrdom had sparked something the shogunate could not extinguish. The faith of those who had fought for freedom became a beacon of hope for future generations. The rebellion had failed, but it had inspired a movement that would continue to grow in the hidden corners of Japan, spreading its message of resilience and faith. Your sacrifice will not be forgotten, Kiyoshi, Taro whispered one evening, standing alone before the small monument. Your fight continues through us, and one day the world will see the truth. Taro's words would be passed down, and one day others would rise, inspired by the same cause that had driven Kiyoshi and his comrades to their final stand. The spirit of Shimabara, their courage, their sacrifice, and their faith would one day light the path for those who would continue the struggle for freedom. The rebellion may have been lost, but the legacy of Kiyoshi and the others who fought for faith and freedom lived on in the quiet whispers of the oppressed. Their sacrifice had sparked a movement that would inspire future leaders, fighters, and believers to rise against tyranny. Kiyoshi's name, though not etched in the official history books, would continue to inspire those who carried his story, ensuring that the spirit of the rebellion could never truly be erased. In the end, the rebels of Shimabara may have fallen, but their faith, like the light of a small candle in the darkness, had continued to burn in the hearts of those who would follow. Their resilience, their belief, and their sacrifice would live on, a testament to the enduring power of faith and the unquenchable fire of resistance. In the quiet aftermath of the Shimabara Rebellion, as the embers of the battle still smoldered in the hearts of the survivors, Kiyoshi's thoughts often drifted to the man whose shadow had loomed over Japan for years, Oda Nobunaga. Despite the crushing defeat, despite the lives lost in the name of a cause that had seemed so pure, Kiyoshi couldn't help but feel that there was something in Nobunaga's vision, something in the ambition that drove him, that resonated with the rebels' fight. Kiyoshi had heard the stories of Nobunaga, the warlord who had sought to unite Japan during the Sengoku period, a time of perpetual conflict and strife. Nobunaga's name was synonymous with innovation and ruthless ambition. His efforts to centralize power, to break the hold of the warring clans, and to reshape Japan's political landscape had left a profound mark on history. In his drive to create a unified Japan, he had challenged traditions and burned bridges with those who sought to maintain the old feudal ways. To Kiyoshi and many others, this was a man who understood what it took to create change in a world broken by division and bloodshed. As Kiyoshi sat quietly among the survivors, the weight of their loss hung heavy in the air. Their rebellion had failed, but he couldn't help but draw parallels between their struggle and the vision of Nobunaga. Nobunaga had sought to unite Japan, not by force alone, but through decisive action, breaking old alliances, forging new ones, and challenging the status quo. It was a path fraught with conflict, a path where the strongest would rise and the weakest would fall. But the ultimate goal was to bring an end to the chaos that had torn the land apart for so long. The more Kiyoshi thought about it, the more he realized that the rebellion had not just been about resisting the shogunate. It had been a struggle for something greater, for unity, for a world where faith was not suppressed, where belief could thrive without fear. In some way, their fight for freedom mirrored Nobunaga's vision, a unified Japan, free from the grip of those who would tear it apart for their own gain. It wasn't just about fighting for their faith. It was about fighting for the future, for a world where the people would no longer be crushed under the weight of oppression. Kiyoshi's mind wandered back to the early days of their fight, when the rebellion had felt like it might actually succeed, when the fire of hope had burned so brightly in their hearts. It had been a battle for the future, a future that would have been shaped by the sacrifice of those who stood against an empire that threatened to wipe out everything they had fought for. But the shogunate's brutal response to the rebellion had been swift, and the victory they had hoped for was never realized. The walls of Shimabara Castle, once a symbol of their last stand, were now nothing but ruins, and the flames of their defiance had been extinguished. But despite the devastating defeat, Kiyoshi could not forget what had driven them to this point, their belief in a better future. In the days that followed the rebellion's fall, Kiyoshi often found himself lost in thought, contemplating the legacy of those who had fought. He couldn't help but wonder, what had their struggle been for? Was it in vain? Or did their defiance leave a mark that would shape the course of history? "We didn't die for nothing, Kiyoshi," Taro had told him, his voice filled with quiet conviction. "Look at the world around us. Look at the shogunate. We may have lost this battle, but the fire of rebellion has been kindled. The seeds of change have been planted, even if we are not the ones to see them grow." End quote. Taro's words resonated with Kiyoshi, but the sense of loss lingered, threatening to overshadow everything else. The rebellion had been lost, yes, but was their fight truly for nothing? The hope for a united Japan, one where the people's faith and freedom could thrive, still burned in his heart, despite the defeat. Despite the devastation of their rebellion, Kiyoshi knew that their struggle for justice had not gone unnoticed. Hideyoshi, who had been one of Nobunaga's most loyal generals, had witnessed the courage of the Shimabara rebels, a courage that mirrored the vision of his late master, Nobunaga. Ieyasu, the future shogun, would also hear of the rebellion, and though they had fought against the shogunate, their struggle would inspire him to take the steps necessary to unify Japan under a single banner. The defiance of the Christian rebels would be remembered. It was a small spark in the grand struggle of Japanese history, but sparks had a way of spreading, and it was through Nobunaga's legacy and the courage of those who defied him that future leaders would rise to finish what was started, the unification of Japan. Nobunaga's vision, though interrupted by the rebellion's failure, had set the stage for Hideyoshi to complete the task of bringing the country together, and for Ieyasu to create a stable foundation that would last for generations. "I don't know if we'll see the end of this, Kiyoshi," Taro said one evening, his voice quiet as they sat on the outskirts of the village, looking out at the horizon. "But we've shaken the world. And the world will never forget what we've done. There will be more who rise, and they will fight for what we fought for." Kiyoshi nodded, his gaze distant. He knew Taro was right. Even though they had been defeated, the reality of their sacrifice was something the shogunate could not erase. The legacy of their fight for freedom and faith would inspire future generations to rise, to fight, and to continue the struggle for a unified Japan, one that could rise above the bloodshed and division of the past. As Kiyoshi stood by the edge of the village, looking out at the sunset that painted the sky with shades of gold and crimson, he thought of Nobunaga, the warrior who had once sought to unite Japan, but whose methods had left a trail of both admirers and enemies. Nobunaga had believed that a unified Japan was the path forward, one that would not be divided by the endless warring factions. In his own way, Kiyoshi understood now what had driven Nobunaga to challenge the established order, to break tradition, and to reshape the country according to his own vision. But Nobunaga's vision had been built on the violence of war, on the bloodshed of those who resisted. The rebels of Shimabara had fought for something different, a peaceful world where the right to believe, to live as free men, was not a privilege but a fundamental right. Kiyoshi realized that their struggle, though ultimately defeated, had been a vital part of the larger movement toward a united Japan, a Japan that would one day be shaped by the sacrifices of men like Nobunaga and the rebels of Shimabara. They had fought not for power, but for belief. Their legacy would remain, no matter how small or hidden in the grand sweep of history. And as Kiyoshi stood there, he knew that their sacrifice would inspire others, perhaps Hideyoshi or Ieyasu, to pick up the pieces of what had been lost and continue the fight for freedom, a fight that had never truly ended. The rebellion had been crushed, but Kiyoshi's legacy was now part of the larger history of Japan. The vision of Nobunaga, his ambition to create a unified Japan, would continue to shape the actions of future leaders. Though the rebels of Shimabara had failed in their immediate goals, their fight had proven that the spirit of resistance could never be fully extinguished. Kiyoshi's story was one of sacrifice, but it was also a story of hope. Hope that even in the face of overwhelming defeat, the ideas and dreams of those who fought for a better world would live on. And in that, Kiyoshi knew there was victory. It had been several months since the fall of Shimabara Castle, and the air was heavy with the weight of history, not the kind that is written down in books or etched into stone, but the kind that is carried in the hearts of the survivors, in the quiet whispers of the oppressed. The land, once teeming with the sounds of rebellion and the cries of those who fought for freedom, was now a quiet place of desolation. The smoke had cleared, the battle had been lost, and the Tokugawa Shogunate had silenced the rebellion. But even in the silence, the echoes of sacrifice could still be heard, like a faint whisper carried on the wind, whispers of those who had given everything for a belief that could not be erased. Kiyoshi, though he had fallen in the final hours of the rebellion, was far from forgotten. His name had become a symbol not just of resistance, but of faith, unshakable faith, in the face of overwhelming force. His story, like the stories of the other rebels who had died with him, lived on in the hearts of those who had survived the battle. The martyrdom of the Shimabara rebels, their unwavering belief, and their defiance in the face of certain death had left a mark on the world, one that even the shogunate could not erase. In the years that followed the defeat of the rebellion, the shogunate sought to rid Japan of the memory of the rebels. Public executions were frequent. The bodies of the captured rebels hung on display as warnings to anyone who might dare to defy the regime. The Tokugawa sought to make an example of them, to break the spirit of the people by showing them the consequences of resistance. They hoped that by eradicating the survivors and erasing the names of those who had fought, they could extinguish the fire of resistance that had burned so brightly in Shimabara. But the faith of those who had stood against them was not so easily quenched. It lived on, passed down through the generations of the oppressed, lingering in the hearts of those who would never forget the sacrifices made by the rebels. Kiyoshi's name, though lost to the official histories of Japan, was whispered in the Christian community, passed down through hidden prayers and quiet gatherings. He was remembered not as a warrior, not as a man who had led armies or conquered lands, but as a martyr, a man whose sacrifice had shown that even in the face of overwhelming force, the human spirit could stand tall. Taro, the leader of the rebellion, often found himself in the company of the few survivors. As the years passed, their numbers dwindled, but their resolve only grew stronger. Taro, though aged and weary from the struggles of the past, still carried the legacy of Shimabara with him. He often spoke of Kiyoshi, whose faith and sacrifice had been the foundation of the rebellion. It was through Kiyoshi's spirit that the survivors found the strength to continue, even as the world around them seemed to crumble. "We lost everything, Taro," one of the survivors, Akio, said one evening, his voice rough with years of grief. "Our homes, our families, our friends. What's left for us now?" Taro looked out over the darkened fields that stretched before them, the memories of the battle, the screams, the smoke, and the sword clashes fading into the distance. His voice, though tired, was strong. "What's left is our faith, Akio. What we fought for doesn't die with us. We may have lost this battle, but the cause lives on in our hearts. And as long as we remember, as long as we carry the flame of what Kiyoshi died for, it will never be extinguished." Akio's eyes glistened with unshed tears, but there was a quiet determination behind his gaze now. "We will carry it, Taro. We will carry their faith, their courage, and the hope they gave us. We will never forget." The spirit of resistance that had burned so brightly in Kiyoshi and his comrades couldn't be extinguished by death or violence. It was contagious. It was alive. And though they had lost the battle, the legacy of their sacrifice had already begun to inspire the next generation. Kiyoshi's faith, the faith that had led them to this point, became a quiet, rallying cry, an unspoken promise that the fight for freedom was far from over. The Christians who had survived the rebellion did not remain idle. In the years following the crushing defeat, the spirit of the rebellion took root in the hearts of the people, even in the midst of their fear and oppression. Secret gatherings began to form in hidden places, and underground churches flourished in the shadows of the Tokugawa Shogunate's watchful eye. The memory of the martyrs of Shimabara became their rallying cry, the story of their sacrifice passed down through whispers and coded messages. Kiyoshi's faith had been unshakable, even in the final moments of his life. His martyrdom was a testament to the power of belief, and that belief continued to inspire others. Taro, despite his doubts and weariness, became one of the leaders of this new underground movement, teaching the next generation of rebels the same values that had led the Shimabara fighters to stand firm against the shogunate. One cold night, Taro stood before a small gathering of young Christians in the shadows of a hidden chapel, the flickering candlelight casting soft shadows across their faces. "The battle may be lost, but the war is not over," he said, his voice filled with quiet strength. "We continue the fight for what we believe in. What we lost at Shimabara, what we lost in Kiyoshi's death, it will never be in vain." The young Christians nodded, their eyes filled with determination. They knew the road ahead would be long, and that the Tokugawa Shogunate would stop at nothing to erase them. But they also knew that their faith, the faith that had sustained them through the darkest hours, would never die. Kiyoshi's sacrifice was never truly forgotten. Over time, as the Tokugawa Shogunate's grip on Japan began to weaken, his story resurfaced not just among the Christian community, but also in the hearts of those who longed for freedom. His name, though lost to the official histories of Japan, was passed down through the whispers of the oppressed. It became synonymous with sacrifice, hope, and the unshakable belief that faith could withstand any force, no matter how powerful. Hideyoshi, who had risen to power after the fall of the Shimabara rebels, and Ieyasu, who would eventually establish the Tokugawa Shogunate as the ruling power, both understood the impact of the rebellion. Though they sought to control Japan through unity, they knew that the spirit of Shimabara, the spirit of defiance, could never be silenced. It was a flame that had been lit in the hearts of the rebels, and it would continue to burn, inspiring those who would fight for justice and freedom long after the rebellion had been crushed. On the anniversary of the rebellion's fall, Kiyoshi's name was spoken aloud in small chapels, in homes, and in quiet gatherings where people still dared to worship in secret. His legacy lived on, not just in the hearts of the surviving rebels, but in the generations that followed. The fight for freedom, for faith, and for the right to worship without fear had never truly ended. It had only taken on new forms, quiet forms, hidden forms, but always with the same unwavering belief that the soul of a people could never be crushed. Kiyoshi's story had become more than just a tale of resistance. It was a symbol of what it meant to stand firm, even in the face of death, to believe in something greater than yourself, and to know that even the smallest rebellion could change the course of history. His sacrifice had not been in vain. It had sparked a movement, and it would continue to inspire those who carried his memory with them. The enduring faith of Shimabara was not merely the history of a failed rebellion. It was the history of a spirit that refused to be silenced, a legacy that lived on in the hearts of the oppressed. Kiyoshi and his comrades had fought for the right to believe, and though they died, their faith had transcended their deaths. The rebellion may have been crushed, but it had sparked something that could never be extinguished. Kiyoshi's martyrdom had set a precedent for future generations to come. The fight for faith, no matter the cost, would always be worth it. And Shimabara's faith would never fade, for it lived on in those who continued to believe in freedom, justice, and the unbreakable power of faith. As we close the chapter on the Shimabara Rebellion, It's impossible not to be moved by the immense sacrifice and faith of those who stood for what they believed in, despite the overwhelming odds. The rebels may have fallen, their dreams of freedom crushed under the weight of an empire's might, but their legacy remains unbroken and immortal. Their courage, in the face of unimaginable loss, teaches us something profound about the strength of the human spirit, the enduring power of faith, and the unshakable foundation of belief. Even in the deepest moments of despair, the heart of a person armed with conviction can be far stronger than any force that tries to subdue it. But what does the Shimabara Rebellion really teach us? Not just as history buffs or as students of the past, but as people living in the present day. What can we take from their sacrifice that will help us navigate our own struggles in today's world? In our own lives, we all face challenges, some big, some small, some seemingly insurmountable. Whether it's facing personal loss, overcoming fear, or battling injustice, we each find ourselves at a crossroads where we must choose between submission or resilience. And while we may not be fighting a literal war, we are often engaged in battles that are just as real. The battle for our values, our beliefs, and the right to live authentically is a fight we must all face at some point. The rebels of Shimabara didn't win in the traditional sense. They were defeated by a larger, more powerful force. But what they gained, in the end, was something that can't be taken from anyone: peace in their convictions, peace in their purpose. They fought for something greater than themselves, and in doing so, they became symbols of resilience and strength for generations to come. Their faith, though tested by the fires of war, was their greatest asset. It was their shield and their sword, the very thing that kept them going when all hope seemed lost. Now, I want you to think about this. What is your own shield and sword? What is it that you rely on when the world feels like it's closing in around you? What keeps you standing when life seems to push you down again and again? Maybe it's family, like Kiyoshi's was a constant source of strength, even in the face of destruction. Or perhaps it's self-belief, the knowledge that you have the power to rise again, no matter how many times you've fallen. Faith in something bigger than yourself, whether that's spiritual faith, faith in your purpose, or simply faith in humanity, can be a guiding light when everything around you feels uncertain. The greatest lesson the Shimabara rebels can offer us is that faith is not just a religious ideal. It's a way of life. It's the conviction that even when the path ahead is clouded with doubt and fear, we choose to stand firm. We choose to believe that the struggles we face are not without purpose, and that each challenge is a step forward towards something greater, something that transcends the obstacles we encounter. Healing through resilience. Now, let's take a moment to consider how we too can take this lesson of resilience and faith and apply it in our own lives. When life knocks us down, it's easy to feel like there's no way out, like the battle is too much, and that we've lost everything. We can feel like the world is crushing us under its weight, and that our struggles will never end. But like the rebels of Shimabara, we can choose to see our faith, our belief in ourselves, in our purpose, and in our ability to rise above adversity as our strength. Even when the world seems dark, even when we feel alone in our fight, faith can be our anchor. It can help us find hope when we have nothing left to hold on to. The sacrifice of the Shimabara rebels teaches us that true strength isn't found in the absence of fear or pain. It's found in the ability to stand tall despite those things. It's the willingness to choose your beliefs over your fear, to take that first step forward, even when the road ahead seems impossible. That's the real victory, the strength to continue moving forward, even when the battle seems lost. So, what do we do with this lesson? How do we carry it forward in our daily lives? The answer lies in purpose. The rebels of Shimabara fought because they had a reason that was bigger than themselves. They didn't fight for glory, riches, or power. They fought because they believed in justice. They believed that the right to believe, the right to love, and the right to live freely were worth sacrificing everything for. In your life, what is your reason? What drives you to keep going when the going gets tough? Whether it's your family, your dreams, or your values, find that purpose and hold on to it. It will be your compass, guiding you through the darkest times, just as the faith of the Shimabara rebels guided them through their struggles. And if you ever feel lost, if you ever feel like the weight of the world is too much to bear, remember this: faith is not the absence of doubt or fear. It is the choice to move forward, to believe in something greater than the obstacles in your path. And with that kind of faith, you can endure, you can rise, and you can find peace in the face of chaos. The story of the Shimabara Rebellion isn't just a tale of defeat. It's a story of hope, a hope that was kindled in the hearts of the rebels and continues to burn brightly in the hearts of those who carry their memory forward. The price of faith may be high, but the reward, the legacy of that faith is far greater than we can ever imagine. As we reflect on the rebels' sacrifices, let us ask ourselves, what are we willing to fight for? What beliefs, what values are so important to us that we would stand firm even when the world pushes us down? Their struggle is not just a part of history. It is an invitation for us to reflect on our own journey, to embrace our purpose, and to let our faith guide us through whatever challenges lie ahead. In the end, the rebels of Shimabara remind us that faith is not just something we hold inside, it's something we carry in everything we do. And in that belief, we find the strength to continue to rise, to fight, and to live with purpose. Let the legacy of Shimabara be a beacon of light in our own lives. May it remind us that no matter how great the struggle, no matter how difficult the road, we stand firm for what we believe in, and we rise together